Back when I was in college, which now is quite a long time ago, I got very involved in martial arts, specifically Muay Thai, Tang Soo Do. I was part of a martial arts club, trained frequently, and took in a lot of martial arts related materials on different styles and different approaches to doing martial arts. Of course, anybody who's done martial arts knows that one of the most compelling figures is Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee is, of course, iconic for his movie roles, such as the famous movie Enter the Dragon or Return of the Dragon, as well as being Kato in the original Green Hornet. He is famous for his physique as well as for his speed. He's also famous for his famous 1-inch punch. When demonstrating the 1-inch punch, he would put his hand about 1 inch from a person's chest and then generate enough force so that the person would fly into a seat with seemingly minimal effort required. But Bruce Lee was more than his physical ability. He also would develop a whole philosophical approach to doing martial arts, something that he called Jeet Kune Do. And Jeet Kune Do was an amalgamation of different approaches, of different things that he learned early in his life doing martial arts and things that he developed and evolved himself. And Bruce Lee was very much the philosopher. He was very philosophical in his approach as well. And one of his more famous quotes demonstrates this depth of his philosophy. Quote, "Before I studied the art, a punch to me was just like a punch. A kick was just a kick. After I learned the art, a punch was no longer a punch. A kick was no longer a kick. Now that I've understood the art, a punch is just like a punch. A kick is just like a kick. The height of cultivation is really nothing special. It is merely simplicity, the ability to express the utmost with the minimum." The idea of being able to keep things simple is a really good reminder in a world where things seem to get so complicated so quickly. And when we are becoming immersed in information, especially in a new topic that we're not familiar with, it can be easy to start feeling completely overwhelmed by everything you're taking in, by all the information. For anything like me, it's easy to get down certain rabbit holes when investigating, exploring some new topic. It's easy to get caught in tangents. It's easy to get caught in the enormity of everything. And I do enjoy finding out new things, and I do enjoy seeing where an investigation takes me. But at the same time, I can get easily distracted, and I can lose my way pretty quickly. This is why I and we have to be careful not to overcomplicate things and to always try to find simplicity in complexity. As we all know, it is true and unavoidable that the world is a complex place, and it's impossible to avoid that complexity, and nor should we try to. We don't want to oversimplify things. But keeping things simple or trying to find some simplicity to make things more manageable is always a good thing to keep in mind and remember. Being overwhelmed by complexity, being overwhelmed by information, isn't just a natural outcome of learning something new. It also can be an effective strategy in psychological or cognitive warfare. Overwhelming people with information can be particularly debilitating when a company is being sued, especially if the company is being sued by a consumer or somebody that doesn't have the same amount of resources that the large company does. The large company might overwhelm the complainant by giving them boxes and boxes of information, overwhelming their ability to sift through it all. By creating all of this information, the person who's filing the complaint can't keep up with it all and becomes almost stymied in their attempts to bring the suit that's seeking justice around. In fact, this strategy of overwhelming people is used in efforts for disinformation and misinformation, and is actually known as flooding the zone with contradictory information to confuse and dispirit people. When people are looking to eat healthier, for instance, they might see a news report that says red wine is good for you. And then they see another news report that says red wine is bad for you, alcohol is bad for you, or you should eat chocolate or don't eat chocolate. And when we get this contradictory information, when it seems more complex to wade through, people just check out and don't engage in information at all. In terms of politics, this has been proven to be extremely effective. A news story in the magazine journal Vox tells the following, quote, "We live in a media ecosystem that overwhelms people with information. Some of that information is accurate, some of it bogus, and much of it is intentionally misleading. The result is a polity that has increasingly given up on finding the truth." And this is especially damning because in order for a democracy to work, people need to be making decisions in terms of their vote and what they support based on information. And if people just check out, if people fail to any longer take part in that process, they're voting on emotion, which is definitely dangerous, or they're not voting at all, which also is dangerous. And so the idea of flooding the zone with misinformation and disinformation and contradictory information is a technique that we see all the time in cognitive warfare. When we're dealing with this flood of information, finding simplicity in that complexity can be a crucially important skill to manage it all. In fact, more information may not lead to better decisions. Research has found that more information can actually result in worse decisions. There is this idea of a paradox of choice, of having so many options and so much information about these different options that we don't even know what to do with it. We're just overwhelmed. We can become confused by the amount of material that we have to go through, and we can't even know where to begin to make a decision with everything. So what do we do about this? What do we do about all of this information? How do we keep it simple? Well, one thing we can do is we can start by focusing on the key information and not get lost in the sheer overwhelming amount of information. There's an expression of getting lost in the weeds, right? Can't find your way through the forest for the trees. That looking at all the details, looking at all the little bits obscures what the big picture is. And keeping things simple is a way of getting us back to that big picture. We can do this by remembering what our primary goal or goals was or were to begin with in the first place. When we started this critical thinking effort, what were we trying to accomplish and discover through our efforts? Let's take an example of shopping for a car. If all you're doing is looking for a quote unquote car, the prospect can be overwhelming. There's a lot of cars. There's a lot of type of cars. There's a lot of manufacturers of cars. There's a lot of price points of cars. I'm not a car person. You talk to a person who's a car person, they can advise you on exactly what you need. I know how to drive a car. That's about it, even though I'm from Detroit, which I think means I should know more about cars, but I don't. So in looking for a car, within all of these different areas, with all of these considerations, there can be almost an endless amount of information to wade through in terms of how the car was built, where it was built, testing data on safety, on performance, engineering specs, comparisons with other cars in its class, and any other things we could consider if we were going to consider everything. And here's the clear point. When we're car shopping, we don't consider everything. We don't consider most things. We consider things that we want to consider that are important to us. So in order to make that process more manageable, we focus on the features that we care about, like price, like safety, like handling, like getting the family around, like getting through your midlife crisis. Whatever it is, remembering why you're doing it in the first place can help us keep our eye on the big picture of what we need to focus on in looking through the data. This point brings up the strategy of reducing all the information into a smaller number of units rather than a large, complicated set of individual data points. In statistics or in statistical analysis, we might use an approach called factor analysis. In factor analysis, we take a large number of variables and we reduce them to a smaller set of factors. That's why it's called factor analysis. We're not just analyzing all the individual variables, we're analyzing the collections of variables as factors. In qualitative data analysis, we do something similar. We will take all the data we've collected and we will code it into different categories. So it makes the data analysis process a lot easier and helps us to make better sense of the data. So whether in quantitative or qualitative work, simplifying is a crucial step in analyzing. In further thinking about this, we might consider the advice of William of Ockham. More generally known as Occam's razor, William of Ockham suggested that when evaluating evidence and making hypotheses about what set of factors cause something to happen, we should go for the simplest explanation that has the largest explanatory power. So when comparing hypotheses, it is best to use the one that has a smaller number of factors, but can explain as much or more than the one with more factors. Overly complex models can fall prey to a lot of noise and a lot of error that are introduced through the sheer number of variables that are present. So when you think about Occam's razor, you're thinking about being able to explain the most out of the least. It's not the simplest explanation is the best. It's the simplest explanation that can explain the most is better than an explanation which is more complex, but explains less or the same amount. I like to think, when I think about William Ockham, and not that I think about him all the time, I think he would have enjoyed or maybe been horrified by the amount of conspiracy theories that we see proliferating today. The thing about conspiracy theories is that they typically provide very complicated explanations for events that can have far simpler explanations. Being very complicated, they are prone to a lot of error through the sheer number of variables that would need to work together in order for that conspiracy to be possible. So someone might think an election was stolen or fraudulent. But if you think about the sheer number of people that would need to be involved in that conspiracy in order for it to happen, the simpler explanation is that maybe someone just got less votes and lost. Occam's razor would say that's the more likely explanation than the conspiracy explanation. It doesn't mean all conspiracies are untrue, but it does mean that the more complicated and convoluted they get, the less true or the less reliable they probably are. When thinking about simplicity, we can think about the acronym KISS, which stands for Keep It Simple, Stupid. Although I don't like saying the stupid part, you're saying it about yourself. So I'm reminding myself to keep it simple and not go too far into complexity. Needless overcomplication can not only be a drain on resources, but can also confuse our thinking and our clarity of purpose. But again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at as many factors as possible. It does mean that we have to be careful not to get too lost in that process of considering factors, because that process could literally be endless. We constantly need to recheck what we are doing and whether or not what we're doing is unnecessarily complicated. So what steps can you take to find simplicity and complexity and to not to be overwhelmed by information to bring out your own inner William of Ockham? First, remember what we are trying to achieve to begin with. Reorienting to our goal can help us stay on the path and not get too lost in that information and data. We can also think of using it as a compass and checking against various topological features or landmarks to make sure that we're not straying too far off the path or our intended direction. When orienteering, we'll pull out the compass, check our direction against the landmark, and make sure that we're headed in the right direction. Second, you might think about reducing the number of elements into more manageable groups or factors, which allows you to kind of keep control over the complexity. And we do this all the time in our everyday life, and things are set up to help us simplify and make complexity more manageable. So for instance, reducing the sheer enormity and overwhelming nature of a marathon into more manageable, simpler steps. Third, again, remember KISS, or to keep it simple. This does not mean that, again, we should avoid thinking about complexity. However, we can't let complexity overwhelm us. And we can't get lost in the complexity to the point that we are rendered stuck or we can't take action. Keeping things simple can be an important strategy in overcoming the overwhelming feeling of complexity. And if we're thinking about getting information floating our zone, we can always think about what's the simplest thing I need to know? How does it slot into my overall view? And how can I keep it simple so that things stay manageable. So make sure you add your own suggestions for managing complexity through simplicity. How do you manage large amounts of data? How do you manage the overwhelming sense of information and some of that being contradictory? And how do you kind of go about keeping yourselves on track when doing your own kind of critical thinking and analytical work? So make sure to leave your comments in the comment section and the discussion board. Thanks.